in Belgium, the dream of my life was one day to travel the world, taking pictures of every species of bird known to man.
For John Bax, in the intervening years, much of that dream has come true. Many of his associates believe that not only does John Bax love birds, but that he can actually communicate with them, as with this hummingbird.
Sometimes people ask me if anyone could do this, and I tell them I think so, provided you're willing to spend 10 or 12 hours easing your way into the presence of the bird, standing stock still much of the time. The cedar waxwing is one of the least nervous of birds, and actually seems to appreciate some help in feeding her voracious young. It took me less than 6 hours to establish this relationship. Then we just poured in the berries as fast as young throats could swallow. Then there are some, like this killdeer, who require a lot of negotiation before you're granted any privilege.
Whether or not anyone else can do what John Bax does, the fact is that his talent has resulted in some extraordinary films. Mad dances in an enchanted forest, only 10 inches high.
The species is known as the least bittern, and the children are all born acrobats.
But finally, you can't get every picture by placing yourself next to the birds. Some forms of behavior require the use of a blind. Example, the water walking of the western grebes, filmed on Canada's prairie marshes. Experts have speculated about the precise nature of this performance. It's not a mating dance. They often do it in groups of 3. Or sometimes just one will take off in a wild circle. Probably it's just a rite of spring, something fun to do in the month of May, before the restrictions of nesting time.
Another species that impresses me by its size and beauty and majestic quality of flight is the white pelican. It too is a native of Canada's western provinces, and it winters here in southeastern Texas. I'm always struck by the dramatic black undersection of the wings as they come into land. White pelicans are big birds, from 55 to 70 inches long, with a wingspan of over 3 meters, or up to 10 feet.
At this point, John Bax is widely recognized for his films of marsh and woodland birds, and the birds of the Arctic tundra. But shortly, he may be even more celebrated for a 4-year study of the smallest species to be found on planet Earth, the magnificent hummingbird.
Actually, there are more than 320 individual species of hummingbirds. This one is the ruby-throated.
It's a male, as you can tell by the plumage, and the glorious ways the light reflects off its colors.
Color was the first thing that attracted me to hummingbirds. Then I became even more intrigued by their extraordinary qualities of flight. The only bird I know that can fly backwards as well as forward, that can hover in mid-air, holding any position it chooses in perfectly controlled flight.
One day, John suggested to a television producer that he thought he could persuade a friendly hummer to come inside his trailer and pose for slow-motion photography. No possible way, said the producer.
But I had a particular bird in mind and a feeling that he trusted me. And suddenly, there he was, in the trailer, and closing in on the feeder with no visible anxiety. These tiny wings have been clocked at up to 80 beats per second. But here we've slowed them down so that you can see in detail the exceptional control. Later I tried all of that at even slower speeds, but the camera began to make a noise and the bird took off. Still, I had made my point.
One noteworthy thing to be said about the man who loved birds is that his career with a camera didn't even begin until he was past the age of 40, a time when a great many men feel that their life choices are all behind them.
From the time I was 14 to the time I was 40, I worked in a factory, first in Europe, then in Canada. And it was in Canada that fate took me by the hand, here in the city of London, Ontario.
To change his destiny, every man needs one stroke of luck. And John's came here on the campus of the University of Western Ontario. By another stroke of fortune, he met Dr. David Ankney, a man of science with a great enthusiasm for snow geese, and for almost anyone willing to share that enthusiasm. Location also had a lot to do with his changing fate. The area he found himself in now was only 90 minutes' drive from one of the great bird migrating areas of the Western world, Point Pelee, on the north shore of Lake Erie, the southernmost point in all of Canada, south actually of Northern California.
In the green woodlands, just behind the Erie shore, I made my first tentative films with a newly acquired 8mm camera. Most of my early shooting involved the species collectively known as warblers. One of my favorites is the magnolia warbler. Just off the shore, there are always flocks of the commonplace gull, and sometimes the more exotic red-breasted merganser. Before long, I traded in my small camera for more professional equipment, and no longer had to spend all those silent hours getting close to each species. A telescopic lens would now do the trick. Brown thrushes, these are, not long back from their winter quarters. And here, the northern oriole, which used to be known as the Baltimore oriole. A young blue jay, out on a limb. These prothonotary warblers are known as cavity nesters. Any hole in a tree will do. Unlike the common yellowthroat, which goes to the trouble of building its own nest. So does the prairie warbler, seen here with a very rare albino chick. This small one will probably grow up pure white, and wouldn't I love a picture of that? And this might be described as nature in the raw. If you're the last one born, you might never get fed. The species is the American goldfinch.
The following summer, John moved his cameras north to the territory of the black-backed three-toed woodpecker. It attacks only dead trees, pecking out insects for food and drumming out a familiar tattoo. And the pileated woodpecker in a tree not long for this world, the male passing food to the young ones inside.
Each species has its own unique qualities, but to me, this is the most beautiful of all, the red-headed woodpecker seen against a clear blue northern sky.
Every single weekend in the spring, summer, and autumn of several years, John spent out in the fields with his camera. Then, once again, a benevolent fate intervened. A broadcasting station in his hometown of London, Ontario, took an interest in some of the pictures and showed them on television. And that was how, in late spring of the following year, he was invited to be part of an expedition heading for the Canadian Arctic, courtesy of Dr. Ankney.
Never have I felt more truly Canadian than on that morning when I helped to load a DC-3 bound north for Eskimo Point. The official purpose of the expedition was to continue a study of snow geese during their spring migration. My European schooling had taught me little about the real Canadian Arctic, and as I flew toward it, I had visions of igloos, drum dancers, dog sleds, and caribou on the hoof. On landing, I saw no igloos and no drum dances, but I did see a caribou. And there were no dog sleds in sight, but plenty of their modern equivalent, three-wheeled Hondas, fresh from Japan and obviously very welcome here. This was the new Arctic, so I thought, with every now and then traces of an ancient culture to be seen in a passing face.
This, too, was the New North, a modern helicopter taking the expedition out over the tundra, bound for the McConnell River Bird Sanctuary on the shore of Hudson Bay. And even before they landed, there were the snow geese, coming into land after the long journey up from Texas and Latin America. 200,000 pair of them would land in this area before the end of the late spring breakup.
By now, the fast-flowing rivers were free of ice. Along the shore, the land was turning green. But still the waters were icy, and you walked at your own peril, hoping to avoid any sudden fall away that might drench you from head to foot. And there at least part of my Arctic dream came true. Caribou, just a few members of a herd that was said to number 30,000. Out here, I learned early how to recognize an Arctic bird's nest. On the open tundra, the ducks pluck feathers from their own breasts in order to cover and camouflage their eggs. I paid my respects and left. Only to be attacked by one of North America's most interesting birds, an Arctic tern. Becoming aware of the reason for its hostility, I left the territory and went to visit some nearby snow geese. Interestingly, these birds mate on their way north and immediately on arrival make their nest on the open ground, and along with many other birds of the tundra, find themselves under constant attack from the species known as the parasitic jaeger. But once in a while, the snow goose will stand its ground and drive off the intruder. Another tundra bird frequently harassed by the jaeger is the king eider duck, and it too can fend for itself. In this case, there is simply no contest. The adult sandhill crane stands more than 3 feet or a meter tall and can fight its own battles. But there is a time when the chick is vulnerable. During these weeks, the sandhills control their territory with authority, and the Jaegers keep their distance.
Fortunately for the filmmaker, the waters of the tundra are shared by some of the most colorful birds in the world, among them the red-throated loon. Beautiful to the eye, haunting to the ear, truly a bird of the high north.
The only time the redthroat comes on land is to incubate. Both male and female take turns on the eggs for a hatching period of up to 27 days. The Arctic loon takes 2 days longer, but after almost a month, the results are equally delightful.
It was time for John to return south. Arrangements had been made for an Inuit hunting party to guide him across the tundra, but beluga whales had been sighted in Hudson Bay.
I learned then that I could read a compass and walk 65 kilometers in a single day, walking not only out of the tundra, but from one way of life into another. Never again would I stand at a factory bench. From here on, I would be a professional filmmaker, with or without food on the table. Back in Ontario, I made a deposit on a trailer and sat down to plan the rest of my life.
An adventurer with a canoe, that was how John now saw himself, ever more in love with the birds of his vast, adopted land. After a winter of reading, he headed out to the great prairie marshes of Western Canada, and in the next 2 summers paddled more than 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers, in search of his quarry, sighting hardly another human being along the way. It was a very solitary experience, but the rewards, when they came, were ample.
It was here that I first caught sight of these baby American bitterns. They had probably never seen anything that looked quite like me, but didn't seem unduly impressed. For my part, I loved their stylish modern haircuts and oversized feet. They had nothing to fear from me, but this hungry snake was something else. Fortunately, he passed up the bitterns and concentrated on the egg of a sorrel rail. Nothing the mother could do, and I chose not to interfere. The waters here are shallow and exceptionally rich in good-sized fish, particularly pike and carp. I thought I had 2 days' food supply when I captured this one, but closer inspection revealed that she was full of eggs, and there was nothing to do but stroke some oxygen back into her and forget about supper. Next, my attention turned to the eared grebe. Mating had taken place earlier, and now the small chicks were doing a characteristic thing. Shortly after birth, they all seemed to struggle up under the mother's wings and remain there in the warmth, confident of being fed by the other parent.
In the same general area, John came upon some nice specimens of the red-necked grebe, who seemed to have similar arrangements for the care and feeding of their young. And then there was the red-necked filmmaker, up to his hips in icy water. For this sort of picture, he set up a camera nearby and used an extension cable.
I'm not sure why I wanted this particular shot. Perhaps to show my friends in Europe. Perhaps to show why this part of the world was never very heavily settled. Out here, your chances of being eaten alive were really quite good. Some days I spent up to 10 hours in this blind, waiting for the bird that was to be my prime subject for the summer, the superb western grebe. What an extraordinary feeling to be the solitary witness to this wilderness ritual. Then suddenly, they were off and running, or racing as some call it, their feet right on the surface of the water. It was a performance I never got tired of watching, or filming.
Then it was over. He was packing his blind for the last time that summer, and in the sky overhead, the first of the wild geese were beginning to wing their way south.
In another 2 months, I knew the trees would be bare and the northern skies would be empty of birds. Why stay? I was now free as any bird, and I decided to act like one. I too headed south.
John's winter location was well chosen, the lower Gulf Coast of Texas, home of the southernmost waterfowl refuge in the United States. Laguna Atascosa, 45,000 acres of estuaries and salt flats, thorny bush and savanna, the largest parcel of land in the Rio Grande Valley for native plants and wildlife.
I did my bookwork as always and received some additional advice from nearby neighbors. Apparently, I was told the birds I wished to film were on the far side of an alligator pond, and if I wanted to work in security, I would have to make an offering to the resident king alligator before going into that territory. I thought at first that it was just a Texas joke, but then it occurred to me, why take a chance? Particularly when I saw the beasts in question. One of them quite clearly was the head of the tribe, and it was obvious that he was full of expectations. By good fortune, I had found a roadside kill, a white pelican that had been run down by a truck, and it seemed to be a suitable offering. I watched in some suspense to see if my gesture would be well received. From then on, I felt free to wander where I wished in this magnificent refuge. And just over the next hill, I came upon a magnificent sight, a flock of white pelicans and the cormorants that often share their waters. In southern Texas, the wind blows almost every day, and it makes for some striking visual effects. There are large flocks here, not only of pelicans, but of 2 species of cormorants who seem to enjoy fishing in the same rich waters. For the cormorant, too, the Texas wind serves a special purpose, drying out its wings when they threaten to become saturated and inhibit flight. Back on land, a rare sight to a northern photographer, a green jay. Unknown in the north, he has dual citizenship, Mexican and Texan. And like all jays, he is interested mainly in food, using his beak as a kind of shovel. I found him particularly beautiful and watched for hours as he went about his earthly business at Laguna Atascosa. Another exotic bird with a name like a Mexican dance, the chachalaca, native to this territory and rarely seen north of here.
And then for John it was westward ho, on another assignment for television, an assignment that was to become almost an obsession, starting in the mountains of Arizona just 95 kilometers, 60 miles south of Tucson. Here in these hills is a 20-acre preserve of land known as the Mile High Ranch, often referred to as the hummingbird capital of America.
There are known to be 18 separate species of hummers in this area, and this was where I became truly captivated by the marvelous qualities of this tiny bird. When not sleeping, the hummingbird must nourish itself approximately every 10 minutes, from the nectar of flowers or from artificial feeders containing a mixture of sugar and water. People used to add coloring in the belief that the color red attracts hummers, but that idea has been abandoned, probably because the artificial coloring might not be good for them.
When filming here in Arizona, little did John realize that it was the beginning of a pilgrimage that would occupy him for more than 4 years and cover many thousands of miles. A pilgrimage that would start in Texas, extend through Mexico and Latin America, and end in the higher elevations of the South American Andes, and that would clearly establish John Bax as one of the premier bird photographers of the world.
Wiser heads than mine told me, if you're going filming in Latin America, don't try to take your trailer. Somewhere along the southern roads, your brakes will burn out, your shock absorbers will shatter, and your tires will shred. You may even get shot at. But I was not to be deterred. In the past, my trailer had always been with me, and I saw no reason to change now. But somewhere up in the hills, my brakes burned out, my shocks shattered, and my tires shredded. One night I even lay in the field with bullets whizzing over my head. I had no idea who was shooting at whom, and I didn't much care. From here on, I went by public transport, and for many a long mile on foot. And when finally I crossed over into Costa Rica, suddenly it was all worthwhile. For there in a lush valley below was just what I had come for. Hummers in their own natural setting. This beauty I identified as a long-billed starthroat. By now I had learned one new trick of the trade. If you want to find a particular hummingbird, first you find the flower it feeds on, then set up your camera and wait. I set up near the flower of a banana plant and was rewarded with another view of the starthroat. Nearby, a violet saberwing was feeding on the flower of a heliconia plant. Hummingbirds are often difficult to identify. I thought this one to be a green violet ear.
Another season, another country. Things were going well for John at this point. He had sold his Arctic films to television and enough footage from the prairie marshes to be able to fly to his next destination, and then again set out on foot.
My objective now, to find and film some species of hummingbirds which had rarely, if ever, been captured by the camera. And those species were said to exist here, at the higher altitudes of the Ecuadorian Andes, in some of the most beautiful country I had ever seen.
If travel along the coastal roads of Latin America had proved somewhat hazardous, life up here assumed an entirely different character. The mountain villages had a peculiar dignity and serenity, and a sense of their own long history. For these peoples were descendants of the ancient Incas and knew little of life beyond their valley.
They spoke a separate language called Quichua, and it bore no resemblance to the Spanish that I knew. The Inca children were shy at first, but one way or another we communicated. And I knew they found it very amusing that a man with white skin and yellow hair would come from somewhere beyond the clouds to search for birds' nests the size of large pebbles. But as it turned out, they knew where the nests were. They taught me that in Ecuador, most hummingbird nests were to be found in the ravines, and their sharp young eyes saw everything. The mother here is a sparkling violet ear, and her baby is about a week old. The nest is an engineering marvel, made of lichen and thousands of kilometers of spider webbing. I was particularly impressed by the superb colors of this female violet ear. The food source here is the puya plant, a veritable treasure of riches for many species of hummer. Here the sparkling violet ear is joined by the black-tailed train bearer. Then back to the nest, to pass things on to the next generation of train bearers.
Some of these pictures he took in one of the great national parks of Ecuador, parks that are becoming an important part of the national heritage. Flowers wherever you look, South America in all its magnificence. John will go back again and again, for it was there that he met a scientist who influenced his entire study and kept him going when he was both exhausted and homesick.
Dr. Fernando Ortiz, then associated with the Universidad Católica in Quito. I told him about having enticed a hummingbird into my trailer back in Canada, and he showed me this trick. Ah, yes, I said, but you captured it with a net, whereas I created a situation of trust. Either way, there was no harm done, and we became good friends. Now there's a sight, said Dr. Ortiz, and indeed it was. A splendid sword-billed hummer with its beak half open. For my camera, this was a rare treasure. A bird with a beak longer than its body and a tongue as long as its beak. An evolutionary adaptation created so that it could penetrate flowers where the nectar was deeply hidden. As far as research can tell, this was the first time ever that a sword-billed hummingbird had been captured by a film camera. Every time I saw this, I thought I could hear chimes ringing in my native Belgium, where one day I hope to show these films. Yet another surprise. Against the backdrop of Mount Cotopaxi, the world's largest hummer, the giant. And finally, the ultimate objective of my South American voyage. The hummingbird that lives at the highest altitude of all, the Andean hill star. The altitude, 4,000 meters. Getting up there took a long climb, and I was often cold and damp in my sleeping bag. Again, I found the bird by first finding its flower, the Chagiragua, above the tree line and only 200 meters below the snow line. This one portrait made it all worthwhile.
2 weeks later, John Bax was 2 continents away, back in the land of his birth for a celebration of one of Belgium's most prominent naturalist societies. He had left here years before, with only a grade 8 education. Now, thanks to the birds in his life, he returned as a celebrity, well known for his films and welcomed by all.
It was for me an extraordinary feeling, being welcomed by the mayor of Turnhout and by the leaders of what is popularly known as the Willowile, the Oriole Society. There were many questions about my travels in Canada and the Americas, and I was particularly grateful for the presence of a teacher who had once tried to inspire me and may even have been successful. Now we joked about Charles Darwin and how he had been considered a poor student without much of a future. And I responded that my own education had taken place out in the fields rather than in the classroom. Finally, who knows where anyone learns best? There in the setting of my old schoolyard, with people I had known since youth, I was carried back almost 50 years, and I could see myself clearly at the age of 10, always the first one out when the school bell rang, out of the door and off and running. My route was almost invariably the same, along the canal road where I even found interest in some domesticated birds from the nearby farms. Then away again over some trenches still faintly visible from the First World War, and finally the object of my heart's desire, the nest of a crested grebe. I would sit there by the hour, dreaming ahead to the places I would go, and the birds that I would see when I was all grown up and in full charge of my own life. And that time did come, and so did the birds. Like this great blue heron here on the island of Bonaire in the Netherlands Antilles, just off the coast of Venezuela. After my long South American journey and the trip back to Belgium, I was in need of what they now call rest and recreation, and some kind officials rented me a small place right at the edge of the ocean. There was very little in the way of human company. But it wasn't long before the birds noted my presence, and I found myself playing the role of parent to some orphaned pelicans, brown ones this time. They were old enough to fly, but didn't seem to know how to feed themselves, so I undertook to do their fishing for them. Every morning they would wait just outside my door, all very willing to gulp down anything I could provide or that they could pick up along the beach. But rarely did they challenge the waves. That apparently was my job, while they stood on the shore waiting. Finally, I wearied of their odd behavior and introduced them to the water, one at a time. They really didn't want to go, and I suppose it was rather flattering to be taken as a kind of father figure feeding my reluctant flock. Later, I learned that during the Middle Ages, at the time of the Crusades, the pelican was regarded as the symbol of Christ. But these hangers-on of mine turned out not to be very good Christians. The moment they discovered a fishing boat working not far offshore, they left me cold and went off in search of the richer pickings to be found there.
At that point, John's interest turned away from birds, if only briefly. On the magic island of Bonaire, there are some endearing little creatures known as iguanas, and he thought that he might study them for a while. But they were someone else's specialty, and that idea didn't last long. So back came the birds. This one a mockingbird, treading lightly among the spikes of an impressive organ-pipe cactus. The mystery is why they don't impale themselves on these slender needles. But apparently there is good nourishment to be had there. Even for the giant osprey, whose feet seem a little more tender. And finally, at least for this visit, John's last close-up look at yet another variation of the iguana, a miniature version of the monsters that are said to have roamed the earth millions of years ago, long before the age of the film camera. Then, time to leave. Up north, John knew winter was coming on, and that presented a problem. Where to go? What to do? That would involve some deep thinking, followed by a hard decision.
Back home in Ontario, I became aware once again that not all Canadian birds head south, just because the trees go bare and the land turns white. The gray jay, for example, seems to enjoy the snowy wonderland. So does the evening grosbeak. Perhaps like them, I would stay right here. Or conceivably, I might go back to Manitoba, not to the marshes and the grebes, but to the hunting grounds of the great gray owl. There in the coniferous forest where 40 below zero is a common temperature. If this one could stand it, why not me?
Or perhaps, just perhaps, he might go somewhere he had never been before, out beyond the Canadian plains, past the foothills, all the way west to the Rocky Mountains, there to film a bird that up till now he had only seen in books, the magnificent trumpeter swan.
Perhaps that is what I will do next year.